information. Inquisitive citizens who read widely, explore the web, and debate people with whom they disagree are more likely to escape the perils of living in an information bubble and to demonstrate the values of public-interested citizenship. Citizens who ignore the news altogether or get it only from sources they agree with are more likely to be focused on less universal, more personal issues. But all of these visions of citizenship are consistent with the values of classical liberalism that emphasize limited government, free thinking, open debate, and a reliance on processes, democracy and capitalism, to keep the system from bogging down in tyranny. We argue in this chapter, as we have earlier, that the American public displays all of these visions of citizenship. But we also argue that mechanisms in American politics buffer the impact of apolitical, self-interested behavior so that government by public opinion does not have disastrous effects on the American polity. Although it may seem like some kind of magician's act, we show that Americans as a group often behave as ideal citizens, even though as individuals they do not. Why public opinion does matter. Politicians and media leaders act as though they agree with Key's conclusion, which is the practical reason why, regardless of the founding narrative, public opinion matters in American politics. Elected politicians have their own narrative, which is that the public is keeping tabs on them. When voting on major bills, members of Congress worry quite a lot about public opinion in their districts. Presidents, too, pay close attention to public opinion. In fact, recent presidents have invested major resources in having an in-house public opinion expert whose regular polls are used as an important part of presidential political strategies. And, indeed, the belief that the public is paying attention is not totally unfounded. Although the public does not often act as if it pays attention or cares very much about politics, it can change its mind and act decisively if the provocation is sufficient. For instance, in the 2006 midterm elections, voters showed their frustration with Republican support for the war in Iraq, despite polls that said a majority of Americans had come to oppose the war, by handing the Democrats enough seats in the House and the Senate to give them control in both chambers. And in 2008 and 2010, elections were primarily about voter angst over a depressed economy, a worry that first enhanced and then diminished the Democrats' control of Congress. Multiple protest marches in the year and a half after Trump's inauguration made it clear that women's issues, immigration issues, and gun control were very much on the minds of millions of Americans. In special elections held to fill seats that became unexpectedly vacant, Democrats far outperformed Hillary Clinton's share of the presidential vote, and Democrats succeeded in taking control of the House of Representatives in the 2018 midterms, as well as flipping 7 governorships and 6 state legislative chambers. The public showed it was still paying attention in 2020. Anger over the handling of the COVID-19 crisis, frustration with a tanking economy, and fury over videos showing a black man dying with a white cop's knee on his neck set the stage for the general election in 2020. It was clear for months that even some of Trump's base was disillusioned with his administration, and while turnout surged on both sides, Democrats carried both the popular vote and the Electoral College. The 2022 midterms only underscored the public frustration with Republicans in the age of Trump. Fury at the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs and worry about the future of democracy helped the Democrats offset their expected election losses. While they lost a handful of seats and control of the House, they held the Senate. But in 2024, the economy was again front and center, at least with the swing voters who decide elections. Though the Democrats struggled to make the election about reproductive rights and democracy, high grocery prices made it an uphill climb, and they lost the White House and Congress. Politicians are not alone in their tendency to monitor public opinion as they do their jobs. Leaders of the media also focus on public opinion, making huge investments in polls and devoting considerable coverage to reporting what the public is thinking. Polls are used to measure public attitudes toward all sorts of things, and then the media interpret those polls, setting the narrative about what they mean. Of course, we are familiar with horse race polls that ask about people's voting intentions and lend drama to media coverage of electoral races. Sometimes these polls themselves become the story the media cover, with results tweeted and retweeted as soon as they are available and competing narratives quickly generated online to explain what they might mean. With the availability of a 24-hour news cycle and the need to find something to report on all the time, it is not surprising that the media have fastened on their own polling as a newsworthy subject. Public opinion, or talk about it, seems to pervade the modern political arena. .3 Citizen Values. American reality far from the ideal. In the preceding section, we reminded you of the 2 competing visions of citizenship in America. 1. The ideal democratic citizen who is knowledgeable, tolerant, and engaged in politics, and 2. The apolitical, self-interested actor who does not meet this ideal. Not surprisingly, our behavior frequently combines aspects of each. For instance, some citizens tune out political news but are tolerant of others and vote regularly. Many activist citizens are informed, opinionated, and participatory but are intolerant of others' views, which can make the give and take of democratic politics difficult. We are not ideal democratic citizens, but we know our founders did not expect us to be. As we will see by the end of this chapter, our democracy has so far survived fairly well despite our lapses, but the future depends on the survival of the classical liberal ideal that takes free thinking, public education, limited government, and procedural values as its foundation, and that is able to deal with the flood of disinformation that continually works to subvert that ideal. The ideal democratic citizen understands how government works, who the main actors are, and what major principles underlie the operation of the political system. Public opinion pollsters periodically take readings on what the public actually knows about politics, and the conclusion is always the same: Americans are not very well informed about their political system. Knowledge of key figures in politics is important for knowing whom to thank or blame for government policy, key information if we are to hold our officials accountable. For instance, virtually everyone, 99% of Americans, can name the president, but knowledge falls sharply from there. In 2018, only 64% of the public knew that the Supreme Court has 9 members and fully 13% could not name Mike Pence as the vice president. In 2017, fewer than half, 45%, knew that Neil Gorsuch was a justice on the Supreme Court, and only 62% knew that Paul Ryan was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, a position that is third in line for succession to the presidency, directly after the vice president. Americans have a reasonable understanding of the most prominent aspects of the government system and the most visible leaders, but are ignorant about other central actors and key principles of American political life. Interest in politics is also highly variable in the United States. Only about a quarter of Americans say they follow public affairs most of the time. Taken together, the moderate levels of political knowledge and interest indicate that the American public does not approach the high levels of civic engagement recommended by civics texts, but neither are they totally ignorant and unconcerned. Another key value for our ideal citizen is tolerance. In a democracy, with many people jockeying for position and many competing visions of the common good, tolerance for ideas different from one's own and respect for the rights of others provide oil to keep the democratic machinery running smoothly. Tolerance is a prerequisite for compromise, which is an essential component of politics generally and of democratic politics particularly. How do Americans measure up on the important democratic requirement of respect for others' rights? The record is mixed. As we saw in Chapter 5, America has a history of denying basic civil rights to some groups, but tolerance in general was on the rise since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Small pockets of intolerance persisted, primarily among extremist groups, although as we saw in the What's at Stake. In Chapter 5, more and more of it has bubbled to the surface since the 2016 election cycle. The anonymity of channels of communication on the internet, from Twitter to Snapchat, allows people to express socially inappropriate and even downright racist views without fear of retribution. In fact, the idea that we should conform to respectful ways of referring to each other has been condemned as rampant political correctness, and its opposite blossoms on some social networks and even in one-to-one personal and social relationships. In terms of general principles, most Americans support the values of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and political equality. For instance, 90% of respondents told researchers that they believed in free speech for all, no matter what their views might be. However, when citizens are asked to apply these principles to particular situations in which specific groups have to be tolerated, especially unpopular groups like the American Nazi Party preaching race hatred or atheists preaching against God and religion, the levels of political tolerance drop dramatically. In studies of political tolerance, the least politically tolerant are consistently the less educated and less politically sophisticated. For example, one study found that, on a civil liberty scale designed to measure overall support for First Amendment rights, only 24% of high school graduates earned high scores, compared with 52% of college graduates. In practice, the mass public's record has not been bad, and some of the worst offenses of intolerance in our history, from slavery to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, were led by elites, not the mass public. A final characteristic of ideal citizens is, not surprisingly, that they participate in the system. One of the most consistent criticisms of Americans by those concerned with the democratic health of the nation is that we do not participate enough. And indeed, as participation is usually measured, the critics are right. For instance, among industrialized nations, the United States ranks among the last in voter turnout, see figure 10.1. Various explanations have been offered for the low U.S. turnout, including the failure of parties to work to mobilize turnout and obstacles to participation such as restrictive registration laws, limited voting hours, and the frequency of elections. We examine who votes and why in Chapter 12, but for now the fact remains that among industrialized nations, the United States has one of the lowest levels of voter turnout in national elections, although greater levels of participation are seen among those with more education and higher income. 10.4 What influences our opinions about politics? Sources of differing opinions in the American public. Clearly many, but by no means all, Americans approximate the characteristics of our so-called ideal democratic citizen, and the traits of ideal democratic citizenship are not distributed equally across the population. But the fact that education and socioeconomic status have something to do with our political opinions and behaviors still does not tell us where our opinions come from. There are forces around us that bring most of us to consensus on the basics of the political culture we learned about in Chapter 1, and more complex forces that guide us into adopting the more divisive ideologies we studied in the same chapter. Mechanisms of early political socialization, how we learn shared narratives about the rules of the game. Democracies and, indeed, all other political systems depend for their survival on each new generation's picking up the values and allegiances of previous generations, beliefs in the legitimacy of the political system and its leaders, and a willingness to obey the laws and the commands of those leaders. Children in France or China support their leaders as surely as children of the United States support theirs. Key here is the sharing of an essential narrative about the founding of a country and the values that support it and deserve loyalty. We learn our earliest opinions through a process called political socialization, whereby values, beliefs, and attachments to political ideals are transferred from generation to generation. Early on, those values are supportive of the political system as we learn patriotism and good citizenship skills. The key agents of socialization are family, school, and houses of worship, all of which have an interest in turning out well-behaved children with loyalty to country. Socialization is like mediation in the sense that the information we pick up comes through channels that may be controlled by people or organizations with interest in having us behave in particular ways. In olden days, of course, socialization was face-to-face, or maybe face-to-pastor or face-to-teacher, but now the possible agents of socialization have multiplied with the growth of the internet and social media. Our fundamental values may be shaped in part by people we never see, never meet, and may not even be aware of. For obvious reasons, the family is probably the biggest influence on our political development. We begin to learn fundamental values about getting along with others in our homes. We may be taught the golden rule or how to share toys with a sibling or the value of taking turns or of not cheating at games. Some of these values are more explicitly political. Children typically develop an emotional response to some fundamental objects of government before they really understand much about those objects. They learn that the police are good. In most communities, the president is important, and the flag deserves respect. Thus, one of the important orientations that develops in the preschool years is patriotism, a strong emotional attachment to the political community. Children saluting the flag or watching fireworks at Independence Day celebrations easily absorb the idea that being American is something special. Children also tend to choose the same political party as their parents. Schools, where many children begin their day with the Pledge of Allegiance, and where school books explicitly emphasize stirring narratives about national origins, founding heroes, and patriotism, are also an important agent of political learning and the development of citizen orientations, which is why school boards and local curricula have become battlegrounds in recent years. Most school districts include as part of their explicit mission that the schools should foster good citizenship. In many districts, U.S. history or civics is a required course, and some state legislatures require a course or two in U.S. and state politics for all college students in the state system. Disputes about what we should teach in our schools echo the same culture wars that plague our nation generally. Should we teach students to think critically about race, gender, the environment, and science, or should we harken back to traditional presentations of those things? Perhaps understandably, some parents want schools to reinforce the ideas and values children learn at home and in the family's religious traditions. Generally in this country, however, public education, funded by public dollars, has had at its heart the classical liberal values that we have discussed so often in this book, preparing students to be good democratic citizens and lifelong learners. We attempt to create the ideal democratic citizens we spoke of earlier, even if we fall short. The media we are exposed to can also help build common values, although in that realm as well, there is far less consensus than there used to be. When there were fewer television stations, most children watched the same cartoons, many of which reinforce the values of living an honest, trustworthy, and community-minded life, and even today many things they watch do the same things. But with the fractured, scattered media landscape and the overwhelming influence of video games, online chat rooms, and social media on young people's lives, the media influences the development of young minds in ways that are unpredictable and often unmonitored. The groups we belong to also foster in us basic values. Peer groups have a lot of influence on individuals' social and political attitudes. People who attend the same church tend to have similar political attitudes, as do individuals who live in the same neighborhoods. These tendencies can be traced in part to the ways people select themselves into groups, but they are reinforced by social contacts and by the social media connections that allow us to expand the numbers of peers we can contact and to build on and participate in the stories about who we are. The processes of talking, working, and worshiping together lead people to see the world similarly. The appearance of consensus on rules of the game and basic values can be exaggerated by simple peer pressure. Researchers have documented a phenomenon they call the spiral of silence, a process by which minority voices silence themselves in the face of majority consensus. This relative silence tends to embolden the advocates of the majority opinion to speak even more confidently. Thus, through the spiral of silence, what may begin as a bare majority for a group's position can become the overwhelming voice of the group. Differences in public opinion. Political socialization generally produces a citizenry that largely agrees with the rules of the game and accepts the outcomes of the national political process as legitimate. That does not mean, however, that we are a nation in agreement on most or even very many things. As we get older and are exposed to more influences, our opinions become more complex. Our demographics, including race and ethnicity, gender, and age,